The Cold War, Causes, Consequences, and Cultural Impact. Chapter 2. Factors. Ideology factors. The ideology factors that contributed to the conflict during the Cold War were the fundamental differences between the capitalist and communist ideologies of the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was founded on the principles of democracy, individual freedom, and free market capitalism, which emphasized the importance of private property, competition, and innovation. The United States viewed communism as a threat to these values, believing that it represented an oppressive, centralized government that stifled individual freedom and creativity. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was founded on the principles of socialism and communism, which emphasized the importance of collective ownership of property, social equality, and central planning. The Soviet Union viewed capitalism as a threat to these values, believing that it exploited workers, created economic inequality, and led to social unrest. These fundamental differences in ideology led to a deep-seated mistrust and hostility between the two superpowers, with each side viewing the other as a threat to its way of life. This ideological conflict was reflected in the various proxy wars and other conflicts that occurred during the Cold War, such as the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet-Afghan War. Overall, the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union played a major role in the conflict during the Cold War. Political factors. There were several political factors that contributed to the conflict during the Cold War, including the post-World War II order. The post-World War II order was a major factor in the Cold War. The United States emerged from the war as the dominant global power and sought to establish a new world order based on democratic values and free market capitalism. The Soviet Union, however, saw this as a threat to its own interests and sought to establish its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The division of Germany. The division of Germany after World War II was a significant political factor that contributed to the Cold War. The United States and its allies controlled West Germany, while the Soviet Union controlled East Germany. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 further symbolized the division between the two superpowers. The arms race. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was a major political factor that contributed to the Cold War. Both countries sought to develop more advanced weapons, including nuclear weapons, which created a dangerous and unstable geopolitical environment. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a political factor that brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union had installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which the United States saw as a direct threat to its national security. The competition for global influence. The competition for global influence was a major political factor that contributed to the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to spread their respective ideologies and influence around the world, often through proxy wars and other forms of intervention. The political factors that contributed to the Cold War were complex and interconnected, and reflected the deep-seated mistrust and competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for global power and influence. Economic factors. There were several economic factors that contributed to the conflict during the Cold War, including the different economic systems of the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was a capitalist country with a free market economy, while the Soviet Union was a communist country with a state-controlled economy. These differences in economic systems led to economic competition and conflict between the two superpowers. The role of ideology in economic competition. Economic competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was often driven by ideological considerations. The United States saw itself as promoting freedom, democracy, and prosperity through capitalism, while the Soviet Union saw itself as promoting equality and social justice through communism. The economic impact of military spending. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union had significant economic implications, as both countries invested heavily in military spending. This led to a diversion of resources away from other areas of the economy, such as social welfare programs and infrastructure development. The impact of economic sanctions. The use of economic sanctions was a common tool of foreign policy during the Cold War. The United States and its allies imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union and other communist countries, while the Soviet Union retaliated with its own sanctions. The competition for economic influence in developing countries. The United States and the Soviet Union competed for economic influence in developing countries around the world, often through aid programs and other forms of economic assistance. This competition sometimes led to conflicts and proxy wars, such as in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Economic factors played a significant role in the conflict during the Cold War, reflecting the deep-seated economic competition and ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. Military factors. There were several military factors that contributed to the conflict during the Cold War, including the arms race. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was a major military factor that contributed to the Cold War. Both countries sought to develop more advanced and powerful weapons, including nuclear weapons, which created a dangerous and unstable geopolitical environment. The use of proxy wars. The United States and the Soviet Union often fought proxy wars in other countries, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. These conflicts allowed the two superpowers to engage in military competition and conflict without engaging in direct confrontation. The use of military alliances. The United States and its allies formed military alliances such as NATO, while the Soviet Union and its allies formed the Warsaw Pact. These military alliances further intensified the military competition between the two superpowers. The deployment of military forces. The deployment of military forces in strategic locations was another military factor that contributed to the Cold War. The United States deployed military forces to Europe, Asia, and other regions of the world to contain Soviet influence, while the Soviet Union deployed military forces in Eastern Europe and other regions to expand its sphere of influence. The threat of nuclear war. The threat of nuclear war was a constant military factor during the Cold War, as both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed large arsenals of nuclear weapons. The possibility of a nuclear war between the two superpowers was a constant source of tension and anxiety. The military factors that contributed to the Cold War reflected the deep-seated military competition and mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the potential for catastrophic conflict that characterized the Cold War era. Summary. In this book, we discussed the Cold War and its impact on various aspects of society, including politics, economics, and culture. We talked about the causes and events that led to the Cold War, the impact of the conflict on international relations and global politics, and the changes that occurred in the world after its conclusion. We also explored the ongoing impact of the Cold War on current global politics and international relations. Overall, this book provided an overview of one of the most significant and complex conflicts in modern history and its lasting legacy on the world today. This is just one chapter in my book. If this content interests you, then you might want to get all the chapters under one book. I will leave a link in the description to pick it up at Amazon. I will include links for other books I have published too. Thank you for your interest.